All right, George.
Good morning. It's good to have you with us. My name is George Maxwell, and you have joined the old-fashioned Sunday school of the Cathedral of St. Philip in Atlanta, Georgia, on Sunday, the 21st day of June, 2020. This is the last session of our series titled, Where Do We Go From Here? And as we enter into this session, I'd like for you to think about listening. We've explored the subject of racial relations in our society for the last 3 Sundays. And today we're going to try to listen to what I've called the other side of the coin. I realize that everyone in the class, we have a mixture of white and black and colored folk in the class, but I want to go ahead and try to listen to voices of Black people. And I'm going to do that in a particular way, but it will require many of us to engage in a pretty intentional listening. So I'd like to start the class by letting you think about that. So get settled for a minute and take a deep breath or two. And then I invite you to close your eyes, take another deep breath, and envision someone at some moment who really listened to you. Someone who heard you and knew you better because of the experience. As you hold that image, I want you to feel what it felt like to be listened to, and to understand that the person didn't have to agree with you to listen to you. They simply had to be present. And so the task for many of us today is to open our hearts in a way that allows us to be present and to hear without thinking about whether we agree or disagree or what arguments we might make for or against, simply to be present and to listen. All right. I invite you to open your eyes and assume whatever posture you would like to assume for this presentation. We're going to listen primarily to 2 voices that I have intentionally contrasted. The first voice is that of James Baldwin, a well-known mid-century Black author. He wrote poems and screenplays. He is, of course, the subject of the documentary that I suggested that you watch. And just listening to him talk, I think, will give us all a deeper sense of the subject that we've been discussing. Some of it is hard. He is very direct. And some of it is hard because, frankly, of the white people that are in the scenes that we're going to see. But James Baldwin is a brilliant man whose insights were revelatory, and I think his voice still has much to teach us today. But I'm going to put Baldwin with a man named Emmanuel Acho. Now, Emmanuel Acho is a younger guy. He's currently a commentator for Fox Sports. He comes from Nigerian and American heritage. He went to St. Mark's School in Dallas, Texas, a very elite prep school, where he was a star linebacker, and then went to the University of Texas, where he was also a star football player, played for the Cleveland Browns, spent most of his career with the Philadelphia Eagles, then went to ESPN and is now with Fox Sports. The reason I chose Emmanuel Acho is because, as many of you know, he has recently launched a podcast called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. There are 3 episodes out now. I'm going to draw from 2 of them. Now, one little story about getting that started: after the events in Minneapolis, he decided he needed to do something. He's a deeply Christian, faithful man, and he describes that as his Esther moment, when what he was doing with his life seemed what God was calling him to do. So he decided to launch this podcast, and he talked to some professional folks who could help him produce it. And he decided that the format would be that a friend of his, who was a white woman, would ask him in the first podcast 4 questions. They got it all set up. They had scheduled the date. He got into the studio, and then she called him that morning, that Sunday morning. It was supposed to drop on Monday or Tuesday, and said, I can't do this. I just can't do it. And Acho said that he said to himself, I don't have the luxury of not doing it. And so he went into the studio, figured out what chair to sit in, sat before the cameras, said a prayer, and started. And although I'm going to give you specific clips, I really do encourage you to look at both or all 3 of the podcasts that are out. They're very accessible, and he's just somebody you instantly like. You respect his insight and know that he has something to teach us. So these 2 voices, James Baldwin and Emmanuel Acho, literary genius out of the mid-20th century, and a contemporary man, both speaking to us about the same thing. For the framework, I'd like to use a familiar structure, I hope. I've called it the spiritual path and defined it as containing 4 elements: wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. In our June 7 old-fashioned Sunday school, we went into some depth on these items. And really, we've been talking about them one way or another since the fall. But if you're just joining us for the first time, these 4 elements, wake up, grow up, clean up, show up, are how we've been talking about the spiritual path. So the first element is wake up. And we've kind of made an analogy between this moment and a mystical experience. Some state of awareness that you suddenly find yourself entering, where you can see and feel and experience at a great depth the connections between all of us. The seminal example was Thomas Merton on the corner of Walnut and 4th, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard in Louisville, Kentucky, in which he said, I simply loved everybody there. He could feel that they were all expressions of God's love. They were all connected. Wake up. So as we think about wake up in the context of race relations, I want to show you this clip from the documentary.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight.
I hardly remember the rest of the evening at all. I remember weeping briefly, more in helpless rage than in sorrow, and Billy trying to comfort me. But I really don't remember that evening at all.
Mother dear, may I go downtown instead of out to play and march the streets of Birmingham in a freedom march today? But mother, I won't be alone. Other children will go with me and march the streets of Birmingham to make my country free.
The church was packed. In the pew before me sat Marlon Brando, Sammy Davis, Eartha Kitt, Sidney Poitier nearby. I saw Harry Belafonte sitting next to Coretta King. I have a childhood handover thing about not weeping in public, and I was concentrating on holding myself together. I did not want to weep for Martin. Tears seemed futile. But I may also have been afraid, and I could not have been the only one, that if I began to weep, I would not be able to stop. I started to cry, and I stumbled. Sammy grabbed my arm. The story of the Negro in America is the story of America. It is not a pretty story. What can we do? Well, I am tired. I don't know how it will come about. I know that no matter how it comes about, it will be bloody. It will be hard. I still believe that we can do with this country something that has not been done before. We are misled here because we think of numbers. You don't need numbers. You need passion. And this is proven by the history of the world. The tragedy is that most of the people who say they care about it do not care. What they care about is their safety and their profits.
I'm having trouble getting the screen back. Okay. I want you just to feel the power of that moment and remember our conversations of trauma and how it lives on in the body. And hear the insight that it is concern for security and money that gets in the way of justice. Here is Emmanuel Acho.
My goal was never to hit her, but because she had her headphones in, she didn't hear me, and so she didn't change her course of action. I believe that that's the same thing Black people are doing now. 1960s, we're yelling, we're oppressed. But the course of action wasn't changed. And so we again yell, we're oppressed, but the course of action wasn't changed. And so again we yell, we're oppressed. And now you see the collision that's occurred in America. So while I don't condone rioting, and I'm sure you don't either, because for the most part, Black people and others that are looting and rioting destructively, they're burning down their own homes. But when you think about the 5 different stages of grief, you come up to one stage, which is called anger. And sometimes emotions, they don't know their actions. I remember my mom, when I was a child, she lost her sister. And I just remember her yelling and screaming. And I come outside my room and I see my mom throwing herself into a wall. And I'm wondering what happened. And my dad tells me that my mom's sister had died. Thinking back on that, throwing yourself into a wall, it's not going to change anything. You're actually harming yourself. But sometimes pain and hurt, it doesn't know how to express itself.
In Acho's second episode of his podcast, Matthew McConaughey joins him, asking several questions of his own. This is drawn from the second podcast.
I heard this term the other day, and I'd never heard it before. And I went, what? And talked to this person, he explained it to me. White allergies. White allergies that by where we were raised and how we were raised in our history growing up, there's certain just imported obvious ways that we're prejudiced in ways that we don't even understand. We got white allergies and may not even know it. And so I was sitting there, you know, looking at my own life, and I sit there and I go, all right, to me, Longview High School was over 50% black. I applied to Grambling. I was the first white to ever work at Catfish Station, an all blues, black blues bar on 6th Street. I am married to a non-white immigrant. I have black friends all through my life and still do. But what prejudices may I have via white allergies that I may not even be aware of?
Let me ask you this, actually, since you brought it up before I respond. Has this situation in our world or my video brought out any white allergies that you never saw? Did you have any white allergies that were in your blind spots?
It exposed ways of looking at things in a way that, maybe I didn't see the other side of the coin. As I started off with some of the context you put things in, even very simple things that are like obvious math of, yes, whites and blacks can all have it hard, but whites have never had it harder because of the color of their skin. That's an obvious thing. Now, I maybe realized that, but never looked at that side of the coin until you brought it up. And I'm like, aha, you know. And so it's a very simple thing. So maybe there's just more that I would say for me, more that I'm diving deeper into how I'm looking at things, how I'm looking at myself, how I can learn more, see things from your side more, see things from the black side more, so I can just so I can get a 4-dimensional view here. Because inherently, maybe I have, to some extent, I've been living in a way where I didn't quite see all sides as clear as I could have.
The greatest white allergy that we see played out as black people practically, one of the greatest, backhanded compliments. Let me tell you what I mean. I went to an affluent high school in Dallas, Texas, St. Mark's. And when I was a kid, they would always say, Acho, you don't even talk like you're black. Or, Acho, you're like an Oreo, black on the outside, white on the inside. Or, you don't even dress like you're black. I didn't realize how offensive that was at the time. It wasn't until I realized, wait a second, you were assuming that black people don't sound educated. You were assuming that to be black, I have to wear a do-rag or a wave cap and be sagging my pants. You are assuming something about black people, and I contradict that assumption. And as a result, I am not black. And so I think white allergies play themselves out practically in black-handed compliments. Get this one. You're so pretty for a black girl. So that's to imply that being black, I shouldn't be pretty.
It's for the black girl.
Yes.
For a black man part that becomes the allergy you don't see. Wait, you just gave me the backhanded indirect compliment. It was good with you're so pretty or you sound so smart.
But then you say for this. I mean, and I think that the reason, McConaughey, that it's a white allergy is because white people don't recognize it.
Right.
My high school kids, they meant nothing by it. But now all of a sudden it's like, no, that's not a compliment at all.
Heard.
In terms of wake up, I want you to take a moment and just think about what you have become aware of in the last month. What have you become aware of in terms of race relation and racism and our own participation in it in the last month? I have seen schools and institutions make very comprehensive statements about how they're going to change with metrics for which they will be accountable. Why is this happening now and not 2 months ago or 3 months ago or 4 months ago? What changed? What have we individually and collectively waken up to? get a sense of that, I think, in the context of these videos, and we'll move on to the next element. The next element is grow up. We may have these moments when awareness overwhelms us, when we suddenly become aware of the connections we have with each other that we hadn't seen before. But we will interpret them based on how we think, on our structures of understanding things. And we're not going to give those structures up easily. And so it's not enough just to become aware that there's a problem. We also have to grow up in our understanding of what that problem is, how it manifests itself, how we are engaged in it or complicit with it. All of that requires changing how we think. So here's another clip from the documentary and James Baldwin. This from the Defiant Ones movie.
Look, man, don't give me that look. You should have got what was coming to you after spitting in that guy's face. Why, you...
It is impossible to accept the premise of the story, a premise based on the profound American misunderstanding of the nature of the hatred between black and white.
That time is now.
The root of the black man's hatred is rage, and he does not so much hate white men as simply wants them out of his way, and more than that, out of his children's way. The root of the white man's hatred is terror,
I'm gonna kill you.
a bottomless and nameless terror,
Right.
which focuses on this dread figure, an entity which lives only in his mind.
Come on! I can't make it. I can't make it.
When Sidney jumps off the train, the white liberal people downtown were much relieved and joyful. But when black people saw him jump off the train, they yelled, "Get back on the train, you fool." The black man jumps off the train in order to reassure white people, to make them know that they are not hated, that though they have made human errors, they've done nothing for which to be hated.
I think the juxtaposition of the two men rolling down the hill is really powerful. On the one hand, they're rolling down the hill in anger and fighting, and on the other hand, they're rolling down the hill in some kind of relationship. But the relationship that I would have interpreted that scene exhibiting is not the relationship that Baldwin gives it. So it's intriguing for me in the context of growing up to begin to understand a different way of thinking about what the black man is doing. When Poitier jumps off the train, what is he really doing? Which is really to prompt the question, what does reconciliation look like? How are we actually going to stay together in ways that respect the mutual humanity and dignity of each other? So as I struggle to get my screen back, I want to leave you with another brief reflection period. How do you think about those guys rolling down the hill? And how do you think we will have to think about reconciliation in order for it to become real? I want to invite you back from that reflection and give you Emmanuel Acho again.
I live in an affluent neighborhood in Austin, Texas, and if I ever go to my mailbox and I see a white woman walking up to the mailbox, I consciously sit in my car because I don't want her to feel like I'm a threat. If I'm on an elevator with a white person, I try to hit the button first and get off the elevator first because I don't want them to perceive me as a threat, because I realize at any point in time, whiteness can be weaponized. We saw that this past week. Amy Cooper, Central Park, the woman who called the cops on a black man who wanted her to leash her dog because it was illegal to walk your dog without a leash. And she used two words that are a death sentence for black people. When she called the cops, she said, "There's a black man who's threatening my life." Both of those things, as far as when you compile them together, were a lie, because that black man, he was a bird watcher. And while so many people saw that incident and they were heartbroken, I, as a black man, saw that incident and was reminded of 1955. Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy who was lynched, mutilated, and killed by two white men because a white woman made a false claim saying that he flirted with her. In 2017, that white woman recanted that story. In 1956, the two white men that killed him, they got off. And they admitted that they did it because they knew they couldn't be charged again due to double jeopardy. That, to me, is white privilege. The ability to weaponize your whiteness and the ability to live life unconsciously. Because I, as a black man, have to calculate every move I make the second I walk outside my house.
In order to grow up in how we're thinking, I think we have to learn to empathize with and have compassion for others. And in that vein, what would it be like if you lived your life with that kind of background noise? If you had to be as alert as he is describing every day, and as conscious of how people were reacting to you as he is describing in something as simple and pedestrian, no pun intended, as the elevator. And this is Emmanuel Acho. You wouldn't think he would have to fear anybody at all, and yet he's walking through his life, even today, with that kind of background noise. In order to grow up, I think we have to empathize, both in terms of how another feels and in terms of the perspective which they constantly take.
George, might I say something about that?
Please. Hey, David.
Hi, how are you? I think this is one of the central difficulties for us who are white, is that we walk out the door and we never think about it. That's what he just said. And yet a black person coming into a white area, any place in this nation, has to constantly be tense, constantly think about who they are and how other people will react to them. And I would suggest that one way of getting this, you sort of alluded to it a week or so ago when you talked about walking around Emmaus House, but go down to South DeKalb Mall. I'm assuming it still exists. I haven't been down there in years. If you go down there, you'll probably be the only white person or one of the very few. And just walk around for a while and see how you feel. It's very instructive. I must say this, I belong to a Masonic lodge down on Peachtree Street, Gate City Lodge number 2, and we were the first acknowledgedly integrated lodge in the state. And it's been very instructive. One, for the grief we unfortunately have taken by integrating, but also because by getting to know each other as people and as brothers, we actually like each other. It changes one's perspective tremendously. And I say that as somebody old enough, as many of us are on this conversation this morning, to remember the bad days of separate drinking fountains, of the constant use of the N-word and the like here in the South, and sometimes in the North. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in. There is a good book, I'll put in a plug, White Rage, written by an Emory professor. That's very good. Another one, The Color of Law. These are books I've read this in the last year. And The Color of Law points out how even the federal government discriminated against black people financially well into the 1970s, something I did not know. I thought much of this had ended with, many of these events that we've been watching happened while I was in high school. Now I realize, no, they did not. And I think it's hard for us. We don't appreciate it as white folks because it doesn't happen to us. We find it hard to believe it's still continuing. Anyway, I think this is a great program. Didn't mean to dominate.
No, thank you. It touches many of us. Yes, ma'am, Mary Hunter.
Sorry, are you ready for the next clip from the James Baldwin piece?
Let me set it up quickly. Thank you. The reason I want to set it up, this element is cleanup, and you will remember that I've described this element as looking into ourselves and discovering what we have denied, what we have resigned to the deep recesses of our soul, and realizing that it's there and it's us. Sometimes as we deny part of ourselves, we wind up projecting it onto others. So we will see in the face of others the very thing that we don't like about ourselves. And of course, that's easy to hate. Now, in addition, in this clip, I just want to let you know there is some language which is difficult. The N word gets used. And I've tried to cut out some of the more brutal violence that surrounds the clip, but it can be hard to hear and watch. So thank you, Mary Hunter.
I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive. But the Negro in this country, the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they're going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger whom they've maligned so long. What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger, I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you've got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference in the North and the South. There's just a difference in the way they castrate you. But the fact of the castration is the American fact. If I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why. And the future of the country depends on that, whether or not it's able to ask that question.
Again, that distinction between the pejorative term and an individual human is a fascinating one to me. Horrifying, tragic, but fascinating. Why, he asks, was it necessary to create this class? Why was it necessary to do it? He kind of dismisses that it's just a historical occurrence or an economic certainty or need in a past or bygone era, right? Because those justifications wouldn't explain Jim Crow. Those justifications would explain the 1866 black codes. Those justifications wouldn't explain what has happened in the 70s and the 80s. So he asks why. And then says, I think the future of the country depends on it. There's this stranger, and how you engage the stranger will dictate who we are as a society. And I think that is the fundamental question for cleaning up. It requires truth-telling, it requires charitable reading, and ultimately it requires change, which can sometimes feel like death, loss of who we thought we were, But really, it's a way of breaking through, breaking your heart open so that you can reach, in this case, the very ideals that we've always proclaimed America to be about. You know, America is not just an ethnic group. America is an ideal. And that we have proclaimed that since the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And so in this case, it's about welcoming that stranger, which Scripture commands us to do, letting our hearts breaking open to a new reality where we move closer to that ideal. So I want you to think about that. What resistance do you feel to those claims? When somebody says, why did you have to create that? Does it feel like you participated in the creating or somebody else did that? Where is the resistance in your own body? Right. I invite you back from that reflection. And once again, give you Emmanuel Acho and Matthew McConaughey.
That's powerful. That's how you put me on the spot. I'm gonna be honest with you, because that's what we're here for, to have uncomfortable conversations. You have to acknowledge that there's a problem.
Yes.
So that you can take more ownership for the problem. The first step to acknowledging it is sitting in this chair right here across from a black man and being like, okay, I may not be talking about you, Emmanuel Acho, but I may be talking about people who look like you. Individually, you have to acknowledge implicit bias. You have to acknowledge that you'll see a black man and for whatever reason, you will view them more of a threat than you will a white man. Probably because society told you to. You have to acknowledge that if there are two people with equal resumes, studies show that the person with the white sounding name is twice as likely to get a call back as a person with a black sounding name. You're a very successful man who probably has several people under you. Are you a part of that statistical problem? Are you looking at a resume saying, man, they sound a little too hood for me? You know, so I think individually, we must each fix the problem, because I believe that individuals, they affect the houses, and the houses, they affect the cities, and the cities affect the states, and the states affect the nation, and the nation affects the continents.
Yes,
exactly. So individually, you have to acknowledge, maybe I do have a bias, and fix it.
Yep. Equality. The definition of equality. What equality is and what is equality not. It's been an American issue forever, and we continue to work and grow and evolve and debate what the definition of equality should be. Is it unilateral equality? There's diverse equality. It's a topic that I don't know that we can answer right now, but I'd love to hear your opinion on it.
I do not think that there is such a thing as equality in America. The wake of slavery is still hitting African Americans. When you get on a boat, whether you're in Lake Austin here, 10 minutes from here, or anywhere in the ocean, if you get on a boat, there is a wake that follows the boat. And although you might not still be driving the boat, there are African Americans getting smacked by the wake left of slavery. Well, Acho, what is that wake? And that's what we talked about. Systemic injustice, poor school systems, voter suppression. There's a wake. And so that's why things aren't equal. Only because there's still a wake from slavery. Don't feel guilty, just acknowledge.
Heard.
The very last words that Acho uttered, I think, are instructive. Don't feel guilty, just acknowledge it, which is one of the things I believe we have to get through in order to fully embrace that part of us that we didn't want to see, both individually and collectively. If the guilt is too much, or if we think it's too sinful for redemption, to cast it in theological terms, then we're not going to do it. And we deny it in all kinds of ways, from apathy to just outright denial. And what Acho is trying to encourage us to do is don't feel guilty, just acknowledge it. And what Baldwin is saying is the future of the country depends on it. Our last step is showing up. And I've described that as doing all of these other things and doing something. So it's waking up, and it's growing up, and it's cleaning up, and it's doing something. That doesn't mean you have to solve the problem all by yourself tomorrow, but it does mean that we have to act. The good news is I think we all exist in spheres of influence where we have power and control, and we can do things that matter. And I do believe that small things lead to larger things. So here's another clip from the documentary.
I would like to add someone to our group here. Professor Paul Weiss, a Sterling Professor of Philosophy at Yale. Were you able to listen to the show backstage?
I heard a good deal of it, but then I was behind the rostrum here.
Yes.
So I heard only some of it.
Did you hear anything that you disagreed with?
I disagreed with a great deal of it. And, of course, there's a good deal I agree with. But I think he's overlooking one very important matter, I think. Each one of us, I think, is terribly alone. He lives his own individual life. He has all kinds of obstacles in the way of religion or color or size or shape or lack of ability. And the problem is to become a man.
But what I was discussing was not that problem, really. I was discussing the difficulties, the obstacles, the very real danger of death thrown up by this society when a Negro, when a black man attempts to become a man.
All this emphasis upon black man and white does emphasize something which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong, I might have gone to Timbuktu, I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than had already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You have to be able then to turn off all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby has anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks I give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
All of the Western nations have been caught in a lie. The lie of their pretended humanism. This means that their history has no moral justification, and that the West has no moral authority.
I think that Baldwin clip is particularly important as it addresses this idea of individualism and the responsibility of everybody individually to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and do what they need to do, as if our society allowed that. Baldwin, of course, counters very prophetically with examples of how that's simply not possible. I recently read something like last week from a Black professor of philosophy at Yale about how he was treated and didn't come out of his house to socialize with other people because of the experiences of racism that he had at Yale on the philosophy faculty, which is intriguing given Weiss's roots there. But what Weiss is claiming is now called colorblind racism. And his simple abstract assumptions that things are fair and structures allow people to take care of themselves is exactly what Baldwin challenges. So let me try to get back to my screen. Okay, show up. This is Baldwin's quote.
What's your responsibility? Today, tomorrow.
People should take the responsibility proactively to say, you know what? Maybe I'm a part of the problem. Maybe I can fix this issue, not just by being not racist, but by being anti-racist. Right. Maybe I can level the playing field and make it a fair fight.
What's your responsibility? Today, tomorrow.
People should take the responsibility proactively to say, you know what? Maybe I'm a part of the problem. Maybe I can fix this issue, not just by being not racist, but by being anti-racist. Right. Maybe I can level the playing field and make it a fair fight.
Before we close, which I want to do with another clip from the Baldwin documentary, I realize that we are past time, but I wonder if there are other questions that people have, realizing that this is really a session about listening and hearing voices we might not have otherwise heard. Okay. I can't see any of you, but I don't hear Mary Hunter or Dan saying their hands raised. So I'm going to move on. I want to thank you for participating in this series. I want to thank you for listening. I know from talking to many of you and the emails and texts that I receive that you are listening and searching for ways to be present. And I appreciate that. Here's our final clip.
But nothing can be changed until it is faced. History is not the past. It is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. If we pretend otherwise, we literally are criminals. I attest to this. The world is not white. It never was white. Cannot be white. White is a metaphor for power. And that is simply a way of describing Chase Manhattan Bank.
I think I have nothing to add to those faces. Thank you. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.